this is what I really find interesting about the United Nations General Assembly, the 80th General Assembly held in this September. You know, the African country head of states did not mince words. States of African countries spoke boldly, spoke intelligently, and most of all, even though that most of them goofed, majority of them really spoke in one voice what they need from the United Nations as a people. So let's hear what they have to say, from John Mahama to Ruto to the other African presidents, what or how intelligently they spoke at the United Nations, seeking their rights, seeking for what is due for Africa.
You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations.
Do you know that Africa makes over a quarter of the United Nations membership, and still, up till today, does not have a permanent seat at the Security Council of the United Nations? So, do you understand where African leaders' pens are coming from when we are talking about their fair share in UN, which has been taken away from Africa, the marginalization that the United Nations has ignored? Let's hear what John Mahama and other African presidents said about this.
In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities.
They called out what they've seen or perceived as decades of marginalization of African countries in the United Nations system. You know, it really stood out for me this time that they didn't mince words. They really spoke out loud this time. They talked about unfair trade policies down to the global crisis where most African voices are ignored. You know, they talked about Africa being absent at the decision-making table, and even the chokehold that IMF, all these international monetary funds are holding down African countries. This is something very clear. Their message was very clear. You know, this time around, they really want reform. They are really speaking out their pens, the pens of African continent as a whole. So hearing that African country presidents are demanding for equity and fair share or fair participation in the United Nations, do you think that these men are being, or these head of states or Africa crying out this time around that they're being too forward about it? Do not forget that the United Nations was formed in 1945, and African countries were one of the founding members. And most African countries were there right from the formation of the United Nations since 1945, but has not fully enjoyed the dividend of this union like other Western countries that are part of it. So today, let's look at some of the things that we should know about the United Nations with African countries. So let me take you back a bit to the history. You know, when the United Nations was formed in 1945, right, most of the African countries were still under colonial rule. But out of the 51 member states, founding member states, there were 4 African countries that were part of it. So Ethiopia, Liberia, South Africa, and Egypt were 4 of the founding members of the United Nations. Other African countries were still under colonial rule. So by 1960, getting independence by most African countries, many of them flocked into the United Nations. And today we have over 54 African countries that are part of the United Nations, member states of the United Nations, making over 28% of the United Nations membership, the highest voting bloc, but still has no seat in the UN Security Council. What does that show you? Is it a fair one? It's just like being in a group where people say that we are all partners, but when it comes to sharing dividends or sharing goodies of that group, some people will get more than the other. Like what we used to hear, or one of these novels that says, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than the other. So one may be asking, what is this about the UN Security Council seat? UN Security Council seat is one of the most consequential, or one of the important seats in the United Nations that has to deal with peace, sanctions, war, decisions that have to be made, very important decisions that have to be made on situations when it is needed. So Africa having more membership in the United Nations, they should be granted such seats. So because of lack of permanent seats, they made it temporary and rotational amongst African countries, 3 African countries. So decisions or interventions that affect Africa directly are often made without Africa having direct impact on them. But seriously, that's a fair asking to be part and parcel of what is going on and where decisions are made. But Africa still needs to sit back, or African country heads of states needs to get their acts together, because Africa needs to be fixed. Even though they touched a lot on some of the things that Africa is working out on to make it work this time amongst African nations, most of the African-led mediations are not given priority. So here's the question. If Africa represents bulk of the membership of the United Nations organization and has the population it takes, has the most natural resources, and the growth prospects that is expected to be seen more in Africa, how long do you think the United Nations can still keep Africa from the tabletop? Drop your comments in the comment section, because Africa, according to every indications or every indices, Africa is the future. So let me know what your thoughts are. Do not forget to like and do not forget to subscribe, because on this channel, I talk about things I find interesting about Africa as we grow and have good prospects that Africa one day will shine the way it's supposed to shine. See you on the next